At my graduation party, I caught my father quietly slipping some powder into my champagne glass. My heart started racing, but I didn't react right away. Instead, I stood up with a calm smile and picked up the glass. I walked over to my sister and casually handed it to her like it was meant for her. She took it without hesitation and drank what was originally meant for me. The cold condensation on the crystal flute felt like an anchor, the only thing keeping me from spinning off the rooftop and into the Chicago skyline. I watched the tiny, relentless bubbles rising through the pale gold liquid, a silent countdown to a betrayal I could barely wrap my head around. Just moments ago, I'd stood in the shadows of a service corridor, my breath hitched in my throat, listening to my father's low, clinical hiss as he discussed solving the problem of my existence. He wasn't talking about an argument or a legal filing. He was talking about the white powder I'd just seen him tap into my glass with the practiced precision of a man who dealt in chemistry and shadows. My own father was trying to poison me at my own graduation party, and as I looked up to see him smiling at the crowd, I realized the man I called Dad was nothing more than a monster in a bespoke suit. The Harris name had always been a gilded cage, but tonight, the bars were turning into a noose. My father, Joseph, was the architect of a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire built on the wreckage of competitors and, if the whispers were true, suppressed data. My mother, Eleanor, was the social glue, a woman who cared more about the thread count of our linens and the resolution of family portraits than the heartbeat of her son. Then there was Sophia, the golden child, the Harvard MBA, the heir who never asked questions. I was the outlier, the one who chose environmental biochemistry at Northwestern instead of the family's cutthroat corporate path. To them, I wasn't a son. I was a loose end, a worthless leech who happened to be sitting on a $12 million inheritance left by the only person who ever truly loved me, my grandmother Lillian. That inheritance was the trigger. Grandma Lillian had been a brilliant chemist forced into silence by the men of her era, and she'd seen the same spark of independence in me. She'd rigged my trust to vest the moment I graduated, a financial lifeboat that would allow me to walk away from the Harris legacy forever. But as I stood on that rooftop at the peninsula, surrounded by ice sculptures and the elite of Chicago society, I realized my parents had a different plan for that money. If I died before the official transfer next week, the millions reverted to them. To my father, I was just another clinical trial that needed to be terminated to save the bottom line. The air on the terrace was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, but all I could smell was the metallic tang of fear. I saw my father signal the head waiter, pointing specifically to the gold-labeled bottle, the family reserve. I watched him hover, his large signet ring glinting under the heat lamps as he personally inspected the flutes. He thought he was being discreet, but my eyes, sharpened by years of looking for the subtle shifts in my mother's moods, caught the slight cloudiness at the bottom of one specific glass. It was a non-lethal dose, I'd heard him tell my mother, just enough to put me in the hospital, to buy them time to move assets, to make me look unstable. But in the world of the Harisas, non-lethal was a flexible term. A toast, my father's voice boomed, cutting through the polite hum of the orchestra. He looked jovial, the picture of a proud patriarch. He began a speech that sounded like praise to the strangers in the room, but to me, it was a eulogy. He spoke of determination and unconventional paths, his eyes tracking my every move like a predator. He handed a glass to my mother, then one to Sophia. Finally, he turned to me, his hand steady as he offered the poison chalice. To Danielle, he said, his smile a jagged line of ice. May your future be everything you deserve. I took the glass. The weight of it felt like lead. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst, but a strange, cold clarity washed over me, the same focus I used during difficult lab finals. I looked at Sophia, standing there in her designer dress, the perfect daughter who had no idea her parents were capable of this. I looked at Taylor and Zoe, my real family, who were filming the moment from the sidelines as I'd whispered for them to do. I knew what I had to do. It was a move born of desperation and a sudden, sharp need for survival. Actually, Dad, I interrupted, my voice ringing out clear and surprisingly steady. I think we should toast the person who really kept me sane these last 4 years. I turned to Sophia, wearing a mask of sibling affection that I'd learned from the best. This special reserve is far too good for just me. Sis, you've worked harder than anyone this year. Take mine. I insist on a trade for the person who's always been the true Harris. Before my father could breathe, before my mother could drop her practiced social smile, I pressed the clouded glass into Sophia's hand and smoothly lifted her own. The world seemed to stop. I saw my father's face drain of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. My mother's knuckles went white as she gripped her own flute. They couldn't say anything. They couldn't stop her without admitting the glass was rigged in front of 300 guests. I watched, my blood turning to liquid nitrogen, as Sophia smiled, thanked me, and took a deep, appreciative swallow of the poison meant for her brother. I sipped from her safe glass, the champagne tasting like ash, and never once broke eye contact with my father. I wanted him to see the exact moment I stopped being his victim and became his reckoning. I didn't know yet how bad it would get, or that within 30 minutes, my sister would be convulsing on the floor while my parents' world began to crumble around them. But in that moment of the toast, I knew one thing for certain. The Harris legacy ended tonight. The heavy silence in the back of my father's car was far more terrifying than the sirens wailing ahead of us. My father's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a rigid line of suppressed fury. He didn't look back at me, not once. He didn't ask if I was okay, or why I'd switched the glasses, or how Sophia was doing. He was a man watching his empire catch fire, and I was the match. My phone buzzed in my lap, a lifeline from the world I had chosen. It was Taylor. Videos sent to your email. It shows everything, Danielle. It shows him giving you the glass. It shows the switch. What do I tell the police? My thumbs flew across the screen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Tell them everything. Show them the video. Don't stop until they listen. When we reached Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the sterile, fluorescent reality of the emergency room felt like a crash landing. Sophia was a ghost of herself, slumped on a gurney, her skin a haunting shade of gray-green as nurses swarmed her. My mother was performing the role of her life, wailing about her precious daughter and the sudden, tragic illness that had struck her down. It was nauseating. I pushed past her, my biochemistry degree finally becoming the weapon I needed. I didn't care about the hierarchy or the skeptical looks from the triage nurses. I demanded the attending physician. I told them exactly what I was, a chemist. And I told them exactly what my father was, a man with a lab full of secrets. You need to screen for cyclopentolate derivatives, I told Dr. Patel, my voice vibrating with a cold, academic precision that seemed to startle her. Modified ones. My father's company, Harris Pharmaceuticals, has been tinkering with a new class of anticholinergics that won't show up on your basic tox panel. It's designed to look like a cardiovascular event or severe food poisoning. Dr. Patel's eyes sharpened. She didn't ask how I knew. She saw the haunted certainty in my eyes and the way I glanced at my father, who was standing by the sliding doors, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap disguise. She reached for the phone to call the police, and I felt the first thread of the Harris legacy begin to unravel. The hour that followed was a blur of blue and red lights and the muffled sound of my mother's protests being drowned out by the reality of a crime scene. Two detectives, Rivera and her partner, moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency. I sat in a small, windowless consultation room, the smell of burnt coffee and floor wax clinging to the air, and laid it all bare. I told them about the $12 million inheritance that would vest in a week. I told them about the FDA investigation and the poisoned riverbeds behind the West facility. I told them about being the worthless leech who happened to have enough integrity to make them sweat. They didn't want a son, I told Detective Rivera, my voice finally cracking. They wanted a bank account and a silent partner. When they couldn't have both, they decided I was an acceptable loss. A knock at the door brought Dr. Patel back, her expression grim but relieved. Preliminary results are in, she announced. We found a modified anticholinergic compound. It's a research-grade drug, something not yet on the market. If you hadn't told us what to look for, Danielle, she would have had permanent heart damage. Or worse. I closed my eyes, a wave of nauseating guilt washing over me. I had saved myself, but at what cost? I had allowed my sister to walk into the trap. You realize, Detective Rivera said softly, her eyes studying me with a mixture of pity and professional scrutiny, that by your own admission, You knowingly let your sister drink what you suspected was poison. The weight of that choice felt like a physical blow. I didn't know what else to do, I whispered, the tears finally spilling over. I needed proof. I thought it was just enough to make someone sick. I didn't think he'd kill his own children. But before I could sink further into the shame, the door was kicked open. My father stormed in, his attorney, Gerald Thorne, trailing behind him like a shark in a gray suit. My father pointed a trembling finger at me, his face contorted into a mask of righteous indignation. This is a fabrication. She's unstable, jealous of Sophia's success. She's been planning to destroy this family for years. But his words were hollow now. Detective Rivera didn't even flinch. She just picked up a business card with 2 fingers, looking at my father as if he were something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Mr. Harris, she said, her voice like iron, we have the video of the toast. We have the toxicology reports. And we have the FBI on the way. The room went silent. The mention of the Bureau seemed to drain the life out of my father. It turned out the poisoning was just the tip of the iceberg. The FBI had been watching Harris Pharmaceuticals for 6 months. Fraud, environmental violations, falsified clinical data. My parents weren't just murderers in the making, they were corporate scavengers who had been poisoning entire communities long before they turned on me. When I finally saw Sophia, she looked small in the hospital bed, the golden child facade stripped away by monitors and 4 drips. She reached for my hand, her grip weak and trembling. Is it true? She rasped. Did he really? Was it for you? I nodded, the truth a bitter pill between us. She told me then about the documents she'd seen, the heavy metal readings, the disposal records she'd signed off on because Joseph told her they were routine. She'd been their shield, their perfect, obedient soldier, while I was the target. We had both been used, just in different ways. The fallout was a tidal wave. Within 48 hours, the Harris name was plastered across every news outlet in the country. CEO and wife arrested for attempted murder. Massive fraud uncovered. I moved into a cramped, messy apartment with Taylor and Zoe, the only place that felt safe from the vultures of the press. Sophia was released a few days later into the care of our Aunt Patricia, a woman our mother had called trash for years because she'd chosen a life of teaching over a life of greed. It turned out Patricia was the only one with enough heart to pick up the pieces. The investigation only grew darker. Agent Donovan from the FBI showed me photos of a storage unit rented in my name, a setup that had been months in the making. My parents had forged my signature, filling the unit with incriminating documents and vials of chemicals, a plan B to frame me for corporate espionage if the food poisoning didn't work. They had been planning my ruin with the same cold calculation they used to balance their ledgers. The poisoning was Plan C, Donovan told me, his face grave. They were never going to let you reach that inheritance, Danielle. 2 weeks later, at the preliminary hearing, I stood on the courthouse steps with Sophia. The air was thick with the shouts of reporters, but I only had eyes for the 2 people in the orange jumpsuits sitting at the defense table. My mother was weeping, a theatrical, desperate sound that no longer moved me. My father sat stone-faced, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the wall behind us. He wouldn't even look at the daughters he had tried to destroy. When the judge ruled that there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all counts, including attempted murder, I felt a strange, cold peace. As we pushed through the crowd toward a waiting car, a reporter yelled out, "Did you know she was switching the glasses? Were you part of the plan?" Sophia stopped. She turned back with a fire in her eyes I'd never seen before, a spark of the Harris iron finally being used for something good. "My sister saved my life," she said, her voice echoing across the pavement. "Our parents tried to kill us both. The only plan here was survival." She took my hand, and for the first time in 22 years, I didn't feel like a Harris. I felt like myself. The legacy of a name can be a heavy thing to carry, but the legacy of a secret is what eventually breaks you. For years, Sophia and I had lived in a house where the air was filtered, the floors were marble, and the truth was whatever Joseph and Eleanor Harris decided it was that day. But as the sirens faded and the legal machinery of the state began to grind my parents into the dirt, the silence they had spent millions to maintain finally shattered. Sophia, still pale from the poison that had nearly stopped her heart, stood beside me and reclaimed the narrative. She told the world that I wasn't the villain, that I wasn't the unstable daughter. She told them that our parents were willing to sacrifice their own flesh and blood to protect a balance sheet. In the wake of the arrests, the Harris family tree began to shake, and relatives we hadn't heard from in decades started falling out of the branches. There was my father's brother, an uncle I never knew existed, who had been erased from the family history for whistleblowing on a pharmaceutical scandal 30 years ago. It turns out, the Harris way wasn't just about success, it was about retribution. If you didn't fall in line, you were deleted. But they couldn't delete us. With the help of Vivian Santos, a lawyer who had the grace of a saint and the tactical mind of a general, Sophia and I began the grueling process of disentangling our lives from the wreckage of Harris Pharmaceuticals. "The trust is yours, Danielle," Vivian told me, sliding a mountain of paperwork across her mahogany desk. "Your grandmother saw the rot in this family long before you did. She didn't just leave you money, she left you a way out." We spent that summer in a state of surreal transition. While the FBI cataloged the fraud, the environmental crimes, and the $100 million cleanup costs my father had tried to hide, Sophia and I returned one last time to our childhood home. It was a tomb of expensive tastes. In my father's study, among the trophies and the leather-bound lies, an agent handed me a weathered journal. It was Grandma Lillian's. Her handwriting, elegant and sharp, spoke across the years. The final entry, written just before she died, felt like a hand on my shoulder. "I have arranged for Danielle's independence. She alone has the strength to break the cycle of this family's poison." I moved to Lillian's old lake house, 2 hours north of the city's suffocating glass towers. It was there, amidst the scent of pine and the rhythm of the water, that the healing actually began. Sophia moved in with me, trading her designer condo for oversized sweaters and a quiet she'd never known. We spent nights on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars Lillian used to point out to us. We were no longer the golden child and the problem child. We were just two sisters, survivors of a war we hadn't asked to fight. The news of the plea deal came on a crisp November morning. 20 years for our father, a decade for our mother in exchange for her testimony on the corporate fraud. They wanted to know if we objected. I looked at Sophia, seeing the woman who had spent her life trying to be perfect for people who didn't deserve her. "I don't want a trial," she whispered, her voice finally steady. "I just want it to be over." And so, 7 months after that fateful graduation party, we sat in a courtroom and watched the Harris empire officially end. My parents didn't look like titans anymore. They looked small. They looked like the frightened, greedy people they had always been beneath the custom-tailored suits. My father stood to give a statement, but he didn't apologize. He spoke of regulatory overreach and protecting the business. He looked at the judge, he looked at the cameras, but he never looked at us. Even at the end, he was a man who believed his own lies. As the bailiff led them away, the heavy oak doors closing behind them with a final, resonant thud, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I just felt light. The air in the hallway was cool and clean. Dr. Lewis was there, along with Taylor and Zoe, the family I had chosen when my own had failed me. "How do you feel, Danielle?" Taylor asked, pulling me into a hug that smelled like real life. "Free," I said, and for the first time, I meant it. "I can finally breathe. Today, I work for an environmental firm, using my biochemistry degree to clean up the very sites my father tried to hide." Sophia is in law school, a fierce advocate for the victims of corporate greed. We still have the lake house, our sanctuary where the only poison is the occasional bad batch of hot chocolate. We've learned that blood might be thicker than water, but it isn't stronger than the truth. My parents tried to poison my body, my spirit, and my future, but in doing so, they only proved how much stronger the antidote of integrity really is. We are the Harisas, but we are the first of our kind to be whole. If you're out there, fighting your own battles against people who are supposed to love you, but only want to control you, remember this: the most powerful thing you can do is survive. You are not the stories they tell about you. You are the truth you live every single day. Thanks for watching.